Nicholas Reed had buried the past, until he saw her bracelet. A little girl in the park, dark curls, bright blue eyes, and a silver bracelet with tiny heart charms, the same one he had given Catherine Watson 7 years ago. The woman who vanished. His pulse pounded. There was only one explanation. And he needed answers. Nicholas Reed never expected his past to find him on an ordinary afternoon in the park. He had come here for a break, a rare moment away from the chaos of boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. His mind had been cluttered with thoughts of business deals, numbers, and market expansions, things that had defined his life for years. He walked slowly along the paved path, hands in the pockets of his tailored coat, barely paying attention to the people around him. The park was filled with families, couples, and joggers, all lost in their own worlds. It was peaceful in a way he rarely allowed himself to experience. Then he saw her. A little girl sat alone on a wooden bench, swinging her legs as she examined something in her hands. She couldn't have been older than 6. Her dark brown curls framed her delicate face, and her piercing blue eyes were focused intently on the silver bracelet wrapped around her wrist. Nicholas's steps faltered. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized the bracelet. It was small, delicate, with tiny heart charms that glinted in the sunlight. It was the exact same bracelet he had given Catherine Watson 7 years ago. The woman he had loved. The woman who had vanished without a trace. His pulse quickened as he approached the girl, his usual confidence shaken. He wasn't sure why, but something deep inside told him that this moment would change everything. He stopped a few feet away, hesitating before speaking. "That's a beautiful bracelet," he said, keeping his voice gentle. The girl looked up at him, her bright blue eyes locking onto his. There was something unsettlingly familiar about them. "Thank you," she said, glancing back down at the bracelet. "It was my mom's." Nicholas swallowed hard. He had suspected it the moment he saw it, but hearing the words confirmed everything. His heart pounded. He had to ask. "What's your mom's name?" The girl tilted her head slightly, as if the question surprised her. "Catherine," she said simply. Nicholas felt the world tilt. She was here. Catherine was here. And this little girl. She had his eyes. Nicholas stood frozen, his mind struggling to catch up with what was happening. The little girl in front of him, Catherine's daughter, was staring at him with quiet curiosity, unaware of the storm raging inside him. Catherine. She was here. After all these years, after all the questions, the sleepless nights wondering why she had left, she was here. And she had a daughter. A daughter with his blue eyes. His heart pounded as he crouched down to the girl's level, carefully keeping his voice even. "What's your name?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Ellie." Ellie. The name felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like something that had always existed in his world but had somehow remained hidden from him. "Ellie," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "That's a beautiful name." She smiled, small but genuine. "Mom picked it." His chest tightened at the mention of Catherine. "Is she here?" he asked carefully. Ellie nodded, glancing toward the end of the park. "We live over there." She pointed toward a quiet street lined with small houses. "She told me not to go too far." Nicholas exhaled slowly, trying to ground himself in the moment. This was real. Catherine was just minutes away. And for the first time in 7 years, he had a chance to get the answers that had haunted him since the day she disappeared. But first, he needed to know something else. "Ellie," he said gently, "do you know your father?" The question made her pause. She looked down at her bracelet, running her small fingers over the silver hearts. "No," she admitted. "Mom never told me." A sharp pang of regret stabbed through him. "She said he was busy," Ellie continued. "That he had important things to do." Nicholas clenched his jaw. That's what Catherine had told their daughter. That he had been too busy. He wanted to be angry, but more than that, he wanted to understand. Do you ever wonder about him? He asked. Ellie shrugged. Sometimes. But I think if he wanted to find me, he would have. Nicholas inhaled sharply. If he had known, nothing would have stopped him from finding her. He took a slow breath and made a decision. Would you take me to meet your mom? Ellie hesitated, as if considering whether or not she should. But something in Nicholas's expression must have convinced her, because after a moment, she nodded. Okay, she said, sliding off the bench. Follow me. Nicholas stood, his pulse racing as he walked beside her. In just a few minutes, he would finally see Catherine again. And this time, she wouldn't be able to walk away without an explanation. Nicholas followed Ellie down the winding path of the park, his thoughts tangled in a whirlwind of emotions. The sound of leaves crunching beneath their feet was the only thing grounding him in reality. Every few steps, he glanced at the little girl walking beside him, still struggling to process what she had just told him. She had no idea who her father was. Catherine had never told her. The weight of that truth settled deep in his chest. For years, he had thought about Catherine, where she had gone, why she had left, whether she had ever thought about him. But never, never, had he imagined that she had left carrying his child. Now, with every step he took, the past he thought was behind him was unraveling before his eyes. Ellie walked with the carefree steps of a child, her small hand gripping the bracelet that had started it all. She didn't seem to realize the magnitude of what was happening, that with each step, she was leading him straight into the past he had been forced to bury. Finally, they turned onto a quiet street lined with modest homes. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and the distant aroma of dinner cooking. It was a simple neighborhood, far removed from the world of luxury Nicholas lived in. Ellie stopped in front of a small house with white shutters and a worn brick walkway. The porch light flickered slightly, casting a warm glow in the fading evening. This is it, she said, pointing toward the door. Nicholas stared at the house, his pulse quickening. Catherine was inside. 7 years. 7 years of unanswered questions, of searching, of wondering why she had left, and now, just beyond that door, she had the answers. He turned to Ellie, swallowing hard. Does your mom know you're bringing me here? Ellie shook her head. No, but she'll be happy. I think. She hesitated. She doesn't have a lot of visitors. Nicholas exhaled, nodding. There was no turning back now. He stepped onto the porch and knocked. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, soft footsteps approached from inside. The door opened. And there she was. Catherine Watson. She froze the moment she saw him. Her deep brown eyes widened, her breath caught in her throat. For a split second, she looked exactly the way she had the last time he saw her, stunning, soft, and utterly unforgettable. But then, reality set in. Her expression shifted from shock to something unreadable. Nicholas, she breathed, gripping the doorframe as if she needed to steady herself. Nicholas's jaw tightened. There were so many things he could say, so many things he wanted to say, but only one question mattered. Why? Catherine swallowed hard, her eyes flickering toward Ellie, who was watching them both with quiet curiosity. Ellie, sweetheart, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Why don't you go inside for a bit? Ellie hesitated but nodded. Okay. She disappeared into the house, leaving them alone. Nicholas took a slow breath, steadying himself. 7 years, Catherine, he said, his voice low. 7 years, and you never told me I had a daughter. Catherine closed her eyes for a brief moment before meeting his gaze again. I wanted to, she whispered. But I was afraid. Nicholas clenched his fists, fighting to keep his emotions in check. Afraid of what? She swallowed hard. Afraid that you wouldn't want her. The words cut deeper than he expected. He had imagined every possible reason for why she had left, another man, a change of heart, even the idea that she had simply moved on. But this? The idea that she had kept his own child from him because she thought he wouldn't want her. That was something he couldn't accept. Catherine, he said, his voice sharper now, you didn't give me a choice. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. I know. Nicholas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to be furious. He should be furious. But more than anything, he just wanted to understand. He looked past her, into the small house, where his daughter, was now waiting inside. Finally, he met Catherine's gaze again. Tell me everything, he said. Because no matter how much time had passed, no matter how many questions remained unanswered, one thing was clear, he wasn't leaving without the truth. Catherine stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in, she said softly. Nicholas hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The house was small but warm. The soft glow of the lamps gave it a cozy atmosphere, and the faint scent of vanilla lingered in the air. It was nothing like the modern, pristine spaces he was used to, but it felt lived in, loved, His eyes swept the room, taking in every detail. A stack of children's books sat neatly on the coffee table. A few drawings were pinned to the refrigerator. A small pink backpack rested by the door. Signs of a life he had missed. Catherine led him to the living room, motioning for him to sit. He remained standing. Ellie's footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway, but she stayed out of sight, giving them space. Nicholas turned back to Catherine, his blue eyes dark with restrained emotion. Start from the beginning. She let out a slow breath, folding her arms as if bracing herself. I never meant to disappear, she admitted. I was scared, Nicholas. He scoffed. Scared of what? Of me? Her gaze flickered downward. Of how you'd react. Nicholas clenched his jaw. So instead of telling me, you ran? Catherine lifted her chin, her brown eyes flashing. You had your whole life planned out. You were about to expand your company internationally. I knew what you wanted, Nicholas, and it wasn't this, she gestured vaguely around the room. Nicholas exhaled sharply. You didn't even give me a chance. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. I thought I was doing the right thing. You were so focused, so determined to succeed. I convinced myself that if I told you, it would ruin everything for you. His hands curled into fists at his sides. And what about Ellie? You didn't think she deserved to know who her father was? Catherine flinched at his words. I planned to tell her. I didn't know when. She shook her head. It was never supposed to be like this. I thought maybe, someday, when she was older, when you weren't so untouchable. Nicholas let out a bitter laugh. Untouchable? He ran a hand through his dark brown hair. You really believed I wouldn't have wanted her? Catherine's lip trembled slightly, and for the first time, he saw guilt in her expression. I didn't know, Nick. I didn't know if you'd want to be a father. And I couldn't take the risk of you saying no. Nicholas took a step forward, lowering his voice. You took that choice away from me. She swallowed hard, nodding. I know. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. After a long moment, Catherine exhaled shakily. I never stopped thinking about you. Nicholas closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the past pressing against his chest. You should have come back. She nodded slowly. I know. He looked toward the hallway, where Ellie was still out of sight. The little girl who had no idea she had been kept from him. The little girl who had his eyes, his blood, his name, * even if she didn't know it yet, *. When he turned back to Catherine, his expression was unreadable. What now? Catherine wiped at her eyes before squaring her shoulders. That's up to you. Nicholas studied her for a long moment. Then he made his decision. I'm not leaving. Catherine's breath hitched. For 7 years, I didn't know I had a daughter, he said firmly. That ends today. A single tear slipped down her cheek. You mean that? His gaze didn't waver. I do. For the first time in a long time, he knew exactly what he needed to do. He had missed 7 years of his daughter's life. But he wasn't going to miss another second. The weight of Nicholas's words settled between them, shifting something unspoken in the air. He had spent years making decisions with absolute certainty, but nothing had ever felt as final as the words "I'm not leaving." Catherine studied him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. She must have expected hesitation, conditions, anything but this unwavering certainty. But there was none. She swallowed hard, nodding. Okay. Nicholas exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. So what do we tell Ellie? Catherine hesitated. I don't know. She glanced toward the hallway where their daughter remained just out of sight. I don't want to overwhelm her. She's still just a kid. Nicholas nodded, understanding the concern, but that didn't change the reality. She deserves to know. I know, Catherine said softly. I don't know how to tell her in a way that won't confuse her. Nicholas ran a hand through his dark brown hair, exhaling slowly. Then we do it together. For the first time in 7 years, he wasn't facing this alone. Catherine's lips pressed together, and after a moment, she nodded. Okay. Let's do it. Nicholas turned toward the hallway. Ellie? There was a brief pause before small footsteps approached. She peeked around the corner, her blue eyes flickering between them. Yes. Nicholas motioned her forward. Come here, sweetheart. Ellie stepped into the room, hesitantly climbing onto the couch next to her mother. She curled her legs beneath her, her small fingers still gripping her bracelet. Is something wrong? Catherine smiled gently, reaching out to brush a curl from Ellie's forehead. No, sweetheart. We need to talk to you about something important. Ellie's brows knitted together in confusion, but she nodded. Okay. Nicholas took a deep breath. Ellie, do you remember when you said you didn't know who your dad was? She nodded again, watching him closely. Well, Nicholas continued carefully, that's because your mom never told you. Ellie blinked. Why? Catherine squeezed her daughter's hand. Because I was scared, honey. I wasn't sure what was best for you. Ellie tilted her head slightly. But I have a dad. Nicholas felt his heart tighten. Yes, he said, his voice steady. You do. Ellie stared at him for a moment, then her eyes widened slightly. It's you. Nicholas nodded, bracing himself for whatever came next. Ellie didn't move at first. Her little fingers traced the silver hearts on her bracelet, her expression unreadable. Then she whispered, You really mean it? Nicholas leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees so he could look directly into her eyes. I mean it. Ellie swallowed. So, you're my dad. Nicholas nodded again, his throat tight. Yes. Ellie processed this for a long moment before looking at Catherine. Did you know? Catherine nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I knew. Ellie's lips parted, and for a second, Nicholas was afraid she would be angry. But instead, she let out a small breath and said, Oh. It was such a simple word, but it carried the weight of years of unanswered questions. Nicholas felt like the air had shifted, like something invisible had snapped into place. Does this mean, Ellie hesitated, that you're going to stay? Nicholas didn't even need to think. Yes, he said. I'm not going anywhere. Ellie searched his face, as if trying to decide whether she believed him. Then, after a long pause, she did something that completely shattered him. She reached out, tentatively at first, then placed her small hand over his. Nicholas inhaled sharply. It was the first time she had willingly touched him. Ellie looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay." Nicholas curled his fingers gently around hers. For the first time, she was letting him in. And he wasn't going to let her down. That night, Nicholas lay awake in the unfamiliar quiet of Catherine's house. His mind refused to settle, replaying the events of the day over and over. He had come to the park expecting nothing more than a brief moment of solitude, but instead, he had found her, his daughter. Ellie had barely spoken after the conversation in the living room. She had accepted his words, but Nicholas knew that acceptance wasn't the same as trust. It would take time. He wasn't sure how to be patient. He wasn't sure how to be a father. A soft noise from the hallway pulled him from his thoughts. He sat up, listening. The house was mostly dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. Another sound, small footsteps. He pushed the blanket aside and stood, stepping out into the dimly lit hallway. A small figure stood near the kitchen entrance, barely visible in the shadows. "Ellie," he called gently. She turned, her blue eyes wide. She was still wearing her pajamas, her tiny frame wrapped in a blanket, her dark curls messy from sleep. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said softly. Nicholas shook his head. "You didn't." He took a few steps closer. "Couldn't sleep?" Ellie hesitated before nodding. Nicholas glanced at the clock on the wall, past midnight. "Do you want to talk about it?" Ellie hesitated again. Then, after a moment, she nodded and walked toward the couch. She climbed up, pulling her blanket tightly around her. Nicholas sat beside her, leaving enough space so she wouldn't feel trapped but close enough that she knew he was there. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Ellie looked up at him. "Are you mad at my mom?" she asked. Nicholas exhaled. He had spent years being angry, at Catherine, at himself, at the unanswered questions. But now, sitting here with Ellie, it didn't seem to matter anymore. "No," he said honestly. "I was. For a long time. But not anymore." Ellie watched him carefully. "Because you found me?" Nicholas felt something tighten in his chest. "Because I found you," he said, his voice quieter now. Ellie was silent for a moment, tracing patterns on the fabric of her blanket. "I used to wonder what my dad was like," she admitted. "I imagined he was really important. That he was too busy to find me." Nicholas's throat tightened. "I wasn't too busy," he said. "I didn't know." Ellie blinked, processing his words. "You really would have come if you knew." Nicholas didn't hesitate. "In a heartbeat." Ellie seemed to think about that for a long time. Then she looked down at her hands. "Mom always said I have your eyes." Nicholas let out a small breath of amusement. She was right. Ellie shifted, tucking her knees up to her chest. "You don't seem as scary as I thought you would." Nicholas raised an eyebrow. "Scary?" Ellie gave a small shrug. "Mom said you were important. That you had a big job. I thought that meant you didn't smile." Nicholas smirked. "I smile sometimes." Ellie gave him a pointed look. "I haven't seen it yet." His smirk deepened. "You will." A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips, but she quickly hid it by resting her chin on her knees. Nicholas leaned back against the couch. "Do you want to try sleeping again?" Ellie hesitated. Then she whispered, "Can I stay out here for a little?" Nicholas nodded. "Of course." They sat in silence for a while, the room dim and quiet except for the occasional hum of cars passing outside. Eventually, Ellie's eyes grew heavy, her head tilting slightly as sleep took over. Nicholas watched as she curled up against the couch, her breathing slowing. He reached out and carefully adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. For the first time, she had let him be there for her. And he wasn't going anywhere. Nicholas woke up to the soft glow of early morning light filtering through the curtains. He hadn't meant to fall asleep on the couch, but sometime during the night, exhaustion had caught up with him. He shifted slightly, feeling the weight of a small figure still curled up beside him. Ellie. She was still asleep, her tiny frame tucked into the blanket, her dark curls spilling over the pillow. Her breathing was steady, peaceful. Nicholas remained still, watching her for a moment. It was surreal. Less than 24 hours ago, he hadn't known she existed. Now, she was here, curled up beside him, trusting him enough to sleep next to him. The realization settled deep in his chest. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a father. Carefully, he stood up, making sure not to wake her. He stretched his stiff muscles and made his way to the kitchen, unsure of what exactly to do next. His routine had always been simple: wake up, check emails, head to work. Now, there was someone else to think about. He opened the fridge, scanning its contents. It was nearly empty, aside from a few takeout containers and a carton of eggs. His usual breakfast was coffee and whatever was quick. But that wouldn't work now. Ellie needed more than that. Determined, he pulled out the eggs and found a pan. He wasn't much of a cook, but scrambled eggs seemed simple enough. As he cracked the eggs into the bowl, he heard small footsteps padding into the kitchen. "Morning," Ellie mumbled, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Nicholas turned, a spatula in his hand. "Morning." She climbed onto one of the kitchen chairs, watching him with curiosity. "You cook?" He smirked. "I'm trying." Ellie leaned on the table, still groggy. "Mom made the best pancakes." Nicholas paused for a second before turning back to the pan. "I'll have to learn how to make them, then." Ellie looked surprised. "You would do that?" Nicholas glanced at her. "Why not?" Ellie shrugged. "I don't know. It's just different." Nicholas scooped the eggs onto 2 plates and placed one in front of her. "Different good or different bad?" Ellie poked at the eggs with her fork. "I'm not sure yet." Nicholas let out a short chuckle. "Fair enough." They ate in silence for a few moments, the quiet not uncomfortable but thoughtful. Ellie took small bites, her legs swinging slightly beneath the chair. Finally, she looked up at him. "Are you going back to your big job today?" Nicholas took a sip of his coffee, considering his answer. He had spent years prioritizing work above everything else. But now? "No," he said. "Not today." Ellie's eyebrows lifted. "Really?" Nicholas nodded. "I thought we could go get some things for your room. Make it more yours." Ellie hesitated. "Like what?" "Whatever you want," Nicholas said simply. "New bedding, decorations, books. Maybe some paint." Ellie's lips twitched, as if she was fighting a smile. "Mom let me pick the color in our old house." Nicholas leaned forward. "What color?" "Blue." He smirked. "Of course." Ellie tilted her head. "Why, of course?" Nicholas tapped his temple. "Because you have my eyes." A small laugh escaped her lips, but she quickly covered it with another bite of eggs. Nicholas watched her carefully, the way she was slowly relaxing around him, the way the uncertainty in her gaze was being replaced with something softer. For the first time, she was letting herself believe he was staying. And for the first time, Nicholas knew he had something more important to build than any business deal. He had a daughter. And he wasn't going to waste another moment. The day passed in a way Nicholas had never experienced before. His usual schedule would have been filled with back-to-back meetings, calls, and negotiations. Instead, he found himself walking through a department store, following a 6-year-old girl as she carefully picked out things for her new room. Ellie wasn't impulsive with her choices. She took her time, studying each option as if making a decision that would define her entire world. She ran her small fingers over soft blankets, examined shelves of books with a thoughtful tilt of her head, and hesitated at the paint section for longer than expected. "You sure about blue?" Nicholas asked as she traced her fingers over a color swatch. Ellie nodded. "Mom let me pick last time. I think she'd like if I had the same color here." Nicholas swallowed the lump in his throat. It still hit him sometimes, the realization of how much he had missed, how many choices like this he had never been a part of. But he was here now. And he was staying. "Then blue it is," he said. Ellie smiled, small but genuine, and Nicholas knew it had nothing to do with the paint. The next few hours were spent assembling furniture, unpacking books, and placing small personal touches around the room. Ellie didn't ask for much. She didn't fill the space with toys or extravagant decorations. She was careful with what she chose, as if she wasn't entirely sure how long she'd be staying. Nicholas noticed. By the time evening rolled around, the room was no longer just a guest room. It was hers. Ellie stood in the doorway, looking at it as if still unsure. "It's different," she murmured. Nicholas studied her expression. "Good different?" She nodded slowly. "Yeah." Nicholas exhaled, feeling something settle inside him. They had dinner together, something simple, something normal. Ellie told him about her favorite books, the ones she wanted to read again. She asked him questions about his job, what he actually did every day. He answered as best he could, keeping the explanation simple, watching as she tried to piece together who he was outside of just being her father. Later that night, she climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Nicholas sat in the chair beside her, holding a book she had picked. "Ready?" Ellie nodded. He read to her, his voice steady, falling into a rhythm that felt more natural than he expected. Halfway through, her eyes began to flutter shut, her breathing slowing. Nicholas was about to stand when her small voice stopped him. "You'll still be here tomorrow, right?" His chest tightened at how soft the question was, how much she was trying not to sound like she was afraid. Nicholas leaned forward, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "I'm not going anywhere, Ellie." She let out a small breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the blanket. "Okay." Nicholas stayed for a few minutes after she fell asleep, watching the rise and fall of her chest, the way her expression had finally relaxed. He had spent years believing success meant never stopping, never settling, never allowing himself to be tied down. But here, in the quiet of his daughter's room, he realized he had been wrong. Success wasn't about power or control. It was about this. And he wasn't going to let it go. This story is more than just a tale of lost love and unexpected reunions, it's about redemption, responsibility, and the power of second chances. Nicholas Reed starts as a man who believes he has everything figured out. He built an empire, prioritized success, and convinced himself that the past no longer mattered. But fate had other plans. The moment he saw the bracelet on Ellie's wrist, his carefully controlled world cracked, forcing him to confront the life he never knew he had. What makes this story compelling is not just the revelation that Nicholas has a daughter, but his transformation from a man focused on wealth and power to someone who understands what truly matters. He doesn't become a father instantly, trust isn't built in a day. Ellie is cautious, hesitant to let him in, and rightfully so. But through patience, persistence, and genuine care, Nicholas proves that he's not just here because of obligation. He chooses her. Catherine's role is just as crucial. She isn't simply a woman from his past, she's a mother who made difficult choices, ones she believed were best for her daughter. Her reasons for leaving are complex, but her love for Ellie is undeniable. And when Nicholas returns, she must decide whether to let him in or keep protecting the life she built. The ending isn't just about a man finding his family, it's about earning them. Nicholas doesn't erase the years he missed, but he shows that he's here now, and he's staying. Ellie's quiet acceptance of him, her willingness to trust little by little, makes the conclusion all the more powerful. In the end, this story proves that love, whether romantic, parental, or familial, isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, about choosing someone even when it's difficult, about making up for lost time the best way you can. Nicholas didn't just reclaim his past. He built a future worth fighting for. Jackson had built an empire from the ground up, but when a lawyer's call revealed that he had a daughter he never knew existed, his world was turned upside down. As he stepped into the unknown world of fatherhood, he discovered that love, responsibility, and family weren't things you could plan for, they were things you had to learn, and sometimes, they came with unexpected consequences. What was supposed to be a simple act of kindness toward a child became a journey that would change his life forever. Jackson Gray, a self-made millionaire and the CEO of one of the largest tech companies in the country, had always believed that he had everything under control. His life was perfectly mapped out: work, ambition, and success. Family had never been part of his plan. He had never been interested in relationships that involved emotional connections, let alone children. His focus was solely on his company, and anything that didn't align with his goals was seen as an unnecessary distraction. Jackson had long since closed the door on any thoughts of family after a brief affair with a woman years ago. They had shared a passionate but short-lived relationship, and when it ended, Jackson walked away without looking back. He had no reason to think it would come back to haunt him. But all of that changed in an instant. One morning, as he was going through his daily routine, a message arrived from a law firm he didn't recognize. It was a letter that was both official and urgent, requesting his presence to discuss a matter of legal importance regarding an inheritance issue. It wasn't unusual for someone in his position to deal with business-related legal matters, but this felt different. The letter mentioned something about a child, a detail that confused Jackson, as he had never thought of having children. The letter explained that the matter needed to be addressed in person, so Jackson decided to make time to visit the firm. After a few days, Jackson found himself in a sleek, modern office building in the heart of the city. He was still puzzled as to why a law firm was reaching out to him, but his curiosity had begun to gnaw at him. When he entered the firm's office, he was greeted by a young, professional-looking woman who introduced herself as Laura. She asked him to follow her to a conference room where they could discuss the matter privately. "Mr. Gray, thank you for coming," Laura said as they sat down at a polished wooden table. "I'm afraid this is an issue that involves a family matter, and I'm sure you'll be surprised to hear about it." Jackson furrowed his brow. "A family matter? I don't know what you're talking about. I have no family that I'm aware of." Laura nodded sympathetically. "That's understandable. However, we have recently discovered that you are the biological father of a child, a daughter. You were involved with a woman named Rebecca Sullivan several years ago. She had a daughter, and you are listed as the father in her legal documents." Jackson felt his heart skip a beat. He had been in a brief relationship with Rebecca, but he had no idea she had become pregnant. It was hard for him to process the information. Rebecca had never mentioned it to him, and he couldn't believe it was true. He hadn't seen or heard from her in years. The thought that he might have a child, a daughter, out there somewhere was jarring. "Are you telling me I have a daughter?" Jackson asked, trying to process the shock of the situation. Laura nodded. "Yes, Mr. Gray. The girl's name is Lucy Sullivan. She's currently 6 years old. Unfortunately, Rebecca passed away recently in an accident, and now, Lucy is in need of legal guardianship. We've contacted you because, as her biological father, you have legal rights to her care." Jackson sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This was the last thing he had expected when he walked into the office that morning. He had no idea what to do with this new information. It felt like his entire world had been upended, and he struggled to comprehend the responsibility that had just been thrust upon him. I don't know what to say, he finally muttered, still in shock. I didn't even know about her. I never signed up for this. I don't know anything about raising a child. Laura's expression softened, understanding his distress. I realize this is a lot to process. However, we are here to help guide you through the legal aspects of guardianship. Your daughter is currently in foster care, but we have found that she may be in need of someone who can provide a stable and permanent home. We thought it best that you be informed of this situation. Jackson ran a hand through his dark hair, feeling overwhelmed. His life had been carefully planned, and now this unexpected twist had thrown everything into disarray. The idea of becoming a father, especially to a child he didn't know existed, was terrifying. He was used to being in control, and yet, he felt completely powerless in this moment. Do I have any choice in this? Jackson asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. I'm not a family man. I don't know how to take care of a child. Laura leaned forward, her tone kind but firm. It's understandable that you feel this way. But legally, as her biological father, you have the right to step in and take responsibility. If you are not ready to make that commitment, you can choose not to pursue guardianship. But Lucy deserves to know her family, and it's possible you could be the one to provide that for her. Jackson felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had built his entire life around his career, and now he was faced with a decision that could change everything. The thought of raising a child, especially one he hadn't known existed, was overwhelming. But something about the situation, about Lucy, pulled at him. He couldn't just walk away from this. Even though he wasn't ready to be a father, he knew that he couldn't ignore this responsibility. I'll think about it, he said, his voice quiet. I need some time to process all of this. Laura gave him a sympathetic nod. Of course, Mr. Gray. Take the time you need. We're here to help you every step of the way. As Jackson left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had been changed forever. He had always been in control, always in charge of his own fate, but now he was faced with something he couldn't control, a child, a daughter, who needed him. And for the first time in his life, Jackson realized that the future he had envisioned for himself might not be the one that was meant to be. The following days were a blur of confusion and unease for Jackson. After the shocking news about his daughter, Lucy, he had gone back to his usual routine, trying to process the overwhelming information in silence. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, and every time he tried to focus on work, his thoughts would inevitably return to the child he had no idea existed. The idea of becoming a father felt like a foreign concept to him, and the weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. For years, his life had been filled with board meetings, business deals, and the constant pursuit of success. Now, he was being pulled in a completely new direction, one that he wasn't sure he was ready to follow. He hadn't contacted the lawyer or taken any action about Lucy's guardianship yet. The decision felt monumental, and he didn't want to make any hasty choices. It wasn't that he didn't care about Lucy, but he felt unprepared for the kind of life that would be required to care for her. The thought of having a child who was dependent on him, especially one who had health issues, terrified him. He didn't know how to be a parent, let alone a father to a child who had been through so much already. That Friday evening, after a long week of trying to stay focused at work, Jackson decided to visit the law firm again. He needed more answers, more clarity. His head was spinning, and he couldn't let this hang over him any longer. When he arrived at the office, Laura, the lawyer who had been handling the case, was waiting for him. Mr. Gray, she greeted him with a polite nod. I'm glad you came. I know this is a lot to take in, and I want to ensure you have all the information you need to make the best decision for yourself and Lucy. Jackson nodded but remained silent, his mind still processing everything. He sat down across from her, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of him. He wasn't sure if he wanted to be here, but he knew he needed to be. I've been thinking a lot, he began, his voice tight. "I never expected something like this to happen. I didn't know about Lucy, and now I'm supposed to just be her father. I don't know what that means. I don't know how to do this." Laura looked at him with understanding in her eyes. "It's completely natural to feel overwhelmed. Parenthood is a huge responsibility, especially when it's something you didn't anticipate. But it's also an opportunity to make a difference in a child's life, to be the person they need." Jackson leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. "I can't be the kind of father she needs. I'm not equipped for this. I don't have time. I don't know what to do." Laura took a moment before responding, her tone calm but firm. "I understand your hesitation, but Lucy needs a stable home. Right now, she's in foster care, and the system isn't always the best option for children, especially those with medical needs like Lucy's. I can't tell you what to do, but I want you to understand the impact you could have. If you step up, you have the power to give her a chance at a better life, a chance to feel loved and supported." Jackson sat there in silence, her words sinking in. He had never thought of himself as someone capable of giving love like that. Sure, he had cared for people in his life, but this was different. He wasn't a family man. He wasn't the kind of person who had the patience, the emotional investment, to be a good father. But as he thought about it, the idea of Lucy out there, without him, felt unbearable. She was his flesh and blood, and she needed someone who could provide stability and care, even if that person was still figuring it out themselves. "What happens if I don't do anything?" Jackson asked, his voice softer now. Laura hesitated before answering. "If you choose not to take responsibility, the state will continue to place her in foster care, and there's a chance she could be moved around. She could also be adopted by someone else, but Lucy deserves to know her father. She deserves to have you in her life, if you're willing." Jackson's heart twisted in his chest. He wasn't ready for any of this, but he couldn't bear the thought of his daughter being left in the system, of her not knowing who her real family was. He had never been forced to make a decision like this before, and it was like standing at the edge of a cliff, not knowing if he should jump or walk away. "I don't know if I can do this," he said quietly, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "I'm not sure I can change everything about my life." Laura gave him a gentle, empathetic smile. "I'm not asking you to change everything overnight. You don't have to have all the answers right now. But starting with small steps, offering her some stability, that can make a world of difference." Jackson exhaled slowly, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed life start to crumble around him. He had always been in control, always the one making the decisions. But this wasn't something he could control. This was bigger than him. This was a child's life. And for the first time in his life, he realized that maybe control wasn't what mattered most. Maybe love and responsibility were the things that truly counted. "I need time to think," he said, standing up. "This isn't an easy decision. I don't know if I'm ready, but I can't ignore her. I'll let you know what I decide." Laura nodded understandingly. "Of course, Mr. Gray. Take all the time you need. But remember, whatever you choose, we'll support you through it." As Jackson left the office, he felt the weight of the decision on his shoulders more than ever before. He knew he couldn't ignore this. But the reality of becoming a father, of being responsible for someone else's life, was far more daunting than any business deal he had ever encountered. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in his life, he knew he had a choice to make, one that would change everything. The days following his meeting with Laura were a blur for Jackson. He spent his time at work, but his thoughts were far from the usual business matters. The decision about Lucy, his daughter, consumed his mind. He hadn't expected any of this. He hadn't known he was a father. Now, he was faced with the daunting reality of potentially becoming the kind of father he had never thought he could be. Every moment, he wrestled with 1,000 questions. How could he provide the life Lucy needed? Was he capable of being the kind of father she deserved? And more than anything, could he sacrifice the life he had built for himself, his career, and his ambitions to care for a child he barely knew? Jackson had always been a man who controlled his life with precision. Every detail was planned. Every goal was set. He had worked tirelessly to reach the position he was in, and he couldn't remember the last time he had made a decision that didn't directly impact his success. But Lucy wasn't like a business deal. She wasn't an asset that could be managed and handled the way his company's projects were. She was a child, vulnerable and in need of a father's care, and he wasn't sure if he was prepared for that kind of responsibility. After a few sleepless nights, Jackson decided he couldn't make this decision alone. He reached out to Laura and arranged a meeting to discuss more details. He needed to know what would happen to Lucy if he didn't step in. He needed to understand the legalities, the consequences, and most importantly, whether he could still keep his life intact while taking on this responsibility. When Jackson walked into the office, Laura was already waiting for him. She greeted him with a soft smile, but her eyes carried the understanding that the decision weighed heavily on him. She motioned for him to sit, and after a brief silence, she began to speak. "I can tell this isn't an easy decision for you, Mr. Gray," she said gently, her voice soft but firm. "But I want to make sure you have all the information you need to make the best choice for both you and Lucy. It's a big commitment, but you don't have to make it all at once. You can take small steps to get there." Jackson nodded but didn't say anything at first. He was still trying to piece together how his life could change so drastically in such a short time. "I'm just not sure if I'm the right person for this," he admitted, his voice low. "I don't know how to care for her the way she needs, especially with everything I have going on. I've never been a family man. I've spent my whole life focused on work and building my career." Laura leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "It's okay to feel uncertain, but the fact that you're asking these questions already shows that you care. You don't have to have all the answers now. No one expects perfection. What Lucy needs is consistency and love, not perfection. And while you may not have planned for this, sometimes life doesn't give us what we expect, but it still gives us opportunities. This could be your chance to make a real difference in her life." Jackson was silent, his mind racing. He couldn't deny that the thought of stepping up for Lucy stirred something inside him. But it wasn't just the responsibility that scared him. It was the idea that he might not be able to give her what she needed. He wasn't emotionally prepared to be a father. He wasn't sure he could balance his life with the demands of parenthood. "Is there a way out of this? If I decide I'm not ready, if I can't do this?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. Laura paused for a moment, carefully considering his words. "If you choose not to step in, the state will continue to manage her care, and she may end up in another foster home. She could also be adopted by another family. There's a chance she could be moved around multiple times, and children in the foster care system often struggle with a lack of permanence. That's the reality. But, if you take guardianship, you would be her legal parent. You'd have the right to raise her, make decisions for her, and most importantly, provide stability." Jackson clenched his jaw, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't want to think about Lucy being passed from one home to another, not knowing where she belonged. He had seen how fragile the system could be, how many children ended up in limbo, bouncing between foster homes, never truly finding a place to call their own. The idea of Lucy going through that, of her not having someone to rely on, was something he couldn't ignore. His own fears and uncertainties felt small in comparison to what Lucy was going through. She needed him, whether he was ready or not. He sat back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The decision had never seemed so clear, yet it was still terrifying. He had spent so many years building a life for himself that didn't involve anyone else, and now, he had to choose whether to completely alter that life to care for a child who needed him. "Okay," he finally said, his voice steady despite the turbulence inside. "I'll do it. I'll step in for her. But I need to know what I'm getting into. I need to understand everything, how it works, what I'll need to do. I can't just go in blindly. Laura smiled softly, her expression a mixture of relief and understanding. You're making the right choice, Mr. Gray. I'll guide you through every step. We'll work together to ensure that you and Lucy get the best possible start. As Jackson left the office, a strange sense of resolve filled him. He had made the decision, but it still felt surreal. The man who had once defined himself by his career was now taking the first steps toward becoming a father. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: everything was about to change, and for the first time, he was willing to face the unknown, for Lucy. The first few days after Jackson made the decision to step into his role as Lucy's father were some of the most challenging he had ever experienced. He had never been one to shy away from difficult decisions, but this felt different. This wasn't about making deals or closing contracts, this was about a life, a little girl who needed him, and the reality of what that meant. Jackson had always been a man in control, but now he found himself in a situation that was out of his hands. His life, once so neatly organized, had suddenly become a maze of uncertainty and new responsibilities. When he returned home that evening, after his meeting with Laura, the weight of the decision began to sink in even more. He had agreed to take guardianship of Lucy, but the practicalities were overwhelming. Where would she live? What would her future look like? How could he provide her with the stability and care she needed when he wasn't even sure how to be a father? He knew the decision was right in some way, but the reality of it felt like a heavy burden. Jackson couldn't help but think about his own childhood. His parents had always been distant, caught up in their own careers, just like he had been. He had never felt like he was truly their priority. There had been no real emotional connection, just the expectation that he would succeed. And now, here he was, faced with the opportunity to give someone, his daughter, something he had never had, a chance to be cared for, truly loved. But was he capable of that? He sat in his office that night, long after the sun had set, staring at his computer screen, the words and numbers in front of him meaningless. His thoughts kept returning to Lucy. He had seen her once, briefly, a few days ago in the hospital. Her face, soft and full of questions, still lingered in his mind. There had been so much fear in her eyes, but also a faint glimmer of hope, something that made him feel like he couldn't let her down. The next morning, Jackson made his first visit to the foster home where Lucy was staying. He hadn't known what to expect. The thought of seeing her again filled him with a mixture of nerves and uncertainty. He arrived at the modest building, a place that didn't seem like it should house a child who had so much potential. He rang the doorbell and waited. A woman opened the door, introducing herself as Lucy's foster mother. She welcomed him inside with a polite smile but didn't speak much beyond the formalities. Lucy was in the living room, sitting quietly on the couch. When she saw him, her face lit up, but there was still a hesitation in her expression. Jackson couldn't help but notice how fragile she looked, like she might break under the weight of the world. He took a few steps toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hey, Lucy," he said softly, sitting down beside her. He wasn't sure what to say. "What do you say to a 6-year-old girl who you've just learned is your daughter?" "Hi," she whispered, her eyes wide and curious, studying him like she was trying to figure him out. "How are you feeling?" Jackson asked, his voice gentle. Lucy shrugged, looking down at her hands. "I don't know. I miss my mommy." The words hit Jackson harder than he expected. He had known that Lucy had lost her mother, but hearing her say it made the reality of the situation even more painful. He had no idea how to comfort her. He wasn't equipped for this. How do you make a child feel safe when you're not even sure how to be a parent yourself? "I know it's hard," Jackson said, reaching out to take her small hand in his. "But I want you to know that I'm here for you. You're not alone anymore. I'm going to take care of you from now on." Lucy looked up at him, studying his face for a moment, and then nodded slowly. Jackson wasn't sure if she truly understood what that meant, but he could see the glimmer of trust in her eyes, a spark of hope. For the first time in a long time, Jackson felt like he was doing something important. The foster mother gave them some space, leaving the room to prepare some snacks. Jackson sat with Lucy for a while, talking to her about small things, trying to make her feel comfortable. He didn't know what else to do, so he simply listened. She told him about her favorite cartoons, her friends from school, and how she liked to draw pictures of animals. It was a start, a small connection, but it was a connection. And Jackson realized that it was all he could do for now, to show up, to be present. Later, when he left the foster home, his heart was heavy. He had promised Lucy that he would take care of her, but he wasn't sure how to keep that promise. He didn't have the experience, the knowledge, or even the emotional tools to know how to be the father she needed. And yet, he couldn't back away. The idea of leaving her in the foster system, of not stepping up, felt like a betrayal he couldn't live with. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings with lawyers, and figuring out the logistics of bringing Lucy into his home. Jackson didn't have much time to process his emotions. He had to focus on the practical aspects, finding a pediatrician, setting up a room for Lucy, making sure the house was ready for a child. He had always been the type of person to handle things by organizing, by taking charge. But this wasn't something he could control as easily. Lucy's needs were different. They required patience, care, and, above all, understanding. He realized that he couldn't solve all of her problems with a checkbook or a well-executed plan. One evening, after a long day, Jackson sat in the living room, staring at the phone in his hands. He had just spoken with his team at the company, but his thoughts were far from business. The silence in the house was deafening, and for the first time, he realized how empty it had felt without Lucy. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew one thing: he couldn't go back. Lucy was his daughter now, and he had to be the father she needed. Whether he was ready or not. Jackson spent the following weeks adjusting to his new life as a father. It wasn't an easy transition. There were days when he questioned whether he was doing the right thing, whether he was prepared for this responsibility. But there were also moments, small, fleeting moments, where he felt the stirrings of something deeper. Watching Lucy sleep peacefully at night, hearing her laughter as she drew pictures at the kitchen table, seeing the trust she was beginning to place in him, it was these moments that made him realize that he couldn't turn back, even if he wasn't sure where he was heading. One morning, after an exhausting week of juggling his duties as CEO and trying to care for Lucy, Jackson woke up early to find her sitting at the kitchen table, her small hands gripping a crayon as she scribbled furiously on a piece of paper. The sight brought a smile to his face. She had started drawing more, using her artwork to express things she couldn't quite say out loud. Her drawings were filled with bright colors and chaotic, yet somehow perfect, shapes that reflected her growing confidence. "Good morning, Lucy," Jackson said softly as he entered the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. She glanced up from her drawing, her eyes brightening when she saw him. "Morning, Daddy," she said, her voice still small but growing in confidence each day. Jackson felt a twinge of warmth in his chest when she said those two words. He wasn't used to hearing them, he wasn't sure he ever would be, but they somehow felt right. In the beginning, he had felt like an outsider in his own home, unsure of how to act, unsure of how to make her feel safe. But now, as the days passed, he was beginning to see her as his daughter, not just a responsibility. "What are you drawing?" he asked, walking over to take a look at her picture. "It's a house," she said, her voice full of excitement. "A house with flowers and a big tree. I want a house like that one day, with lots of flowers." Jackson studied the drawing. It wasn't perfect, but there was a beauty to it, a sense of hope that was contagious. For a moment, he wondered what it would be like to give her the life she imagined in her drawings, a life full of peace, security, and love. But he knew it wasn't that simple. Life wasn't a drawing you could color in perfectly. It was messy, complicated, and unpredictable. Still, he couldn't help but imagine the possibility of giving Lucy a home that was truly hers, one that was filled with the kind of stability and love she deserved. "Your house looks beautiful," he said, kneeling down beside her. "I think we could make that happen, don't you?" She smiled, a bright, genuine smile that made his heart swell. "Really? You promise?" "I promise," he said, his voice steady, though there was still uncertainty in his own mind. He didn't have all the answers, but he was beginning to realize that he didn't have to. He just had to show up, day after day, and be the father Lucy needed him to be. As the weeks passed, Jackson found himself adjusting more to the rhythm of their new life. The mornings were filled with the chaos of getting Lucy ready for school and balancing his work calls. But in the evenings, they settled into a routine. Jackson would help Lucy with her homework, they'd eat dinner together, and then they'd spend time talking or reading before bed. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that was enough. There were still moments of doubt, still times when Jackson felt like he was failing her. He wasn't always patient, and there were days when he had no idea what to do. But each day, Lucy's trust in him grew stronger, and with it, his own confidence. Slowly, Jackson realized that he didn't need to have all the answers. He didn't need to be the perfect father. He just needed to be there, to listen, and to love her in the way that she needed. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, watching a movie, Lucy turned to him and asked, "Daddy, can we stay here forever? Just us?" Jackson's heart tightened, and for a moment, he was struck by the weight of her question. It wasn't just about the house or the comfort of their home, it was about the future. It was about the stability and love she needed. He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the quiet hope that she would finally be safe, finally have a place to call home. "I hope we can, Lucy," Jackson said, his voice soft but filled with determination. "I'm doing everything I can to make sure we stay together. And I promise, we'll build that home you've always wanted. We'll make it happen." Her eyes brightened with hope, and she curled up against him, resting her head on his shoulder. Jackson wrapped his arm around her, feeling the weight of his promise settle on him. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be more challenges ahead, but in that moment, he knew one thing for sure: he was going to fight for her, for both of them. The road ahead would be long, filled with uncertainties and difficulties, but Jackson had made his decision. He would be the father Lucy needed. And no matter how hard it got, he would never give up on her. Jackson had always prided himself on being a man who could solve any problem, who could face any challenge and come out on top. But the situation with Lucy was different. No matter how much he tried to prepare himself, no matter how much he researched and asked for advice, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was completely out of his depth. He had stepped into a role that he had never prepared for, one that was filled with so much emotion and uncertainty. Lucy, a young girl with a difficult past and a future that was anything but certain, needed him in ways he wasn't sure he could fulfill. He knew he had to keep trying, but there were days when it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. In the days that followed, Jackson focused on getting Lucy settled into their new routine. School was a challenge for her, especially with her medical needs. She was a bright and curious child, but the trauma of her past had left its mark. She was often quiet, withdrawn, and at times, angry. Jackson wasn't sure how to help her cope with her emotions, but he knew that he had to try. He started by taking her to therapy, something he had never really understood before. He had always thought of therapy as a luxury, something for people who couldn't handle their problems on their own. But now, he saw it as something that Lucy desperately needed, a safe space where she could begin to work through her pain and trauma. At the same time, Jackson had been dealing with his own internal struggles. He was no longer the man who only cared about his company and his career. Lucy had become his priority, and it was more than just providing her with a home and food. He needed to be there for her emotionally, but he didn't know how to do that. He wasn't used to being vulnerable, to admitting that he didn't have all the answers. But every time he looked at Lucy, he knew that if he wanted to help her heal, he had to start by being honest with himself. One afternoon, after school, Lucy came home with a report card that she had been hiding in her backpack. She handed it to Jackson quietly, as if it were some sort of burden she didn't know how to carry. Jackson took the paper and glanced at it, reading the comments from her teacher. She wasn't performing at her best, and the teacher had noted that Lucy seemed distracted and withdrawn during class. Jackson felt a pang of disappointment, but he quickly pushed it away. He knew it wasn't her fault. It wasn't about grades, it was about helping her heal, helping her feel safe enough to open up. "You did your best, Lucy," Jackson said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We'll figure this out together, okay?" Lucy nodded, her eyes avoiding his. She had never been one to seek reassurance, but there was something in her posture, something in the way she held herself that told Jackson how much she longed for his approval. He could see the weight of the world in her eyes, and it crushed him. She had been through so much, and yet, she was still here, still trying. He wished he could take away her pain, make everything right, but he knew he couldn't. All he could do was try to be the father she needed him to be, even if he didn't always know how. That night, after dinner, Lucy went to her room as she usually did. She had become more distant lately, spending most of her time alone. Jackson had hoped that things would get easier as time passed, but the challenges only seemed to grow. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space where Lucy had just been, wondering how long it would take before she truly felt like part of his life. Would she ever trust him fully? Would she ever feel safe with him? A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He stood up and opened it to find Laura, the lawyer who had been handling the legal matters related to Lucy's guardianship. She greeted him with a polite smile, but her eyes were filled with concern. "Jackson," she said softly, "I thought we could talk. There's been something I've been meaning to discuss with you regarding Lucy's case." He invited her in, and they sat down at the table. Jackson could tell from the look on her face that this wasn't a conversation he wanted to have. Laura didn't waste any time getting to the point. "There's an issue with Lucy's current foster care status," she began. "As much as she's adjusted to being with you, there are still legal hurdles to jump over. I've been working on securing her permanent guardianship under your name, but there are complications with the adoption process. It might take longer than expected, and during that time, we need to make sure that Lucy's best interests are being met. I'm just letting you know that there may be some bumps ahead." Jackson listened intently, his mind racing. Adoption? He hadn't fully understood how the legal process would work, but now he realized that it wasn't just about bringing Lucy into his home, it was about making sure she was legally and permanently his responsibility. The idea of adoption felt even more permanent, and for a moment, Jackson felt the enormity of the decision. This wasn't just about providing for her, it was about taking full responsibility for her life, her future. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," Jackson said, his voice firm. "I want her to be my daughter in every way possible. But if it's going to take time, I need to be prepared. I need to understand exactly what's going to happen." Laura nodded, offering him a reassuring smile. "I'll keep you updated every step of the way, Jackson. But I believe you're making the right choice. Lucy needs a stable home, and you're the person she can rely on." As Laura left, Jackson stood at the door, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. The journey ahead would be long, and there would be more challenges, but he couldn't turn back now. Lucy had already become a part of his life, and he was determined to give her the future she deserved. Even if he didn't know how to be the perfect father, he would do whatever it took to be the father she needed. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Jackson knew that he was ready to face it head-on. For her. As the months went by, Jackson found himself slowly adapting to the life he never imagined he would have. There were days when he still questioned whether he was truly cut out for this role as Lucy's father. There were nights when he lay awake in bed, thinking about everything he had given up, wondering if he was making the right choice. He had always been focused on success, driven by the ambition to build something that would leave a legacy. But now, his focus had shifted. His legacy was no longer tied to his business empire. It was tied to Lucy. She had become the center of his world in a way he hadn't expected. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized just how much she needed him. And it wasn't just about the basics, keeping a roof over her head, making sure she had food, and taking care of her medical needs. It was about being present for her emotionally, offering her the support she needed to heal from the trauma of her past. He had thought that providing for her physically would be enough, but he quickly learned that emotional support was just as important, if not more so. At first, Lucy had been quiet, withdrawn, reluctant to let anyone in. She had a trust that was hard to earn, and it seemed as though every day she was testing the limits of Jackson's patience. Some days, she would talk to him about things, her favorite cartoons, how she missed her mother, her hopes for the future. Other days, she wouldn't say a word. She would sit alone in her room, drawing pictures that reflected her complex emotions. Jackson had learned to recognize when she needed space and when she needed someone to talk to. And despite the challenges, he found himself growing more attuned to her needs, becoming a father in ways he hadn't known were possible. One afternoon, when Jackson returned home after a particularly grueling day at work, he found Lucy sitting at the kitchen table, a piece of paper in front of her. She was holding a crayon in her small hand, her brow furrowed in concentration as she drew something. Jackson walked over and sat next to her, trying to gauge her mood. "What are you drawing today?" he asked, his voice calm and soft. Lucy looked up briefly, then back down at her paper. "It's a house," she said quietly. "A big house. With a garden and a swing." Jackson's heart warmed at the sight of her drawing. It wasn't just a house. It was a vision of safety, of a home, a place where she could feel grounded and loved. He knew it wasn't just a picture. It was a reflection of everything she longed for, everything she needed. He reached over and gently touched her hand, making sure not to startle her. "It looks beautiful," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I think you're going to have a house like that one day. With flowers and a swing." Lucy nodded slowly, her eyes lifting to meet his. There was still a hesitation there, an uncertainty in her gaze, but Jackson could see something else too. Hope. It was small, fragile, but it was there. And it was enough. "I want to have a garden," Lucy said, her voice a little more confident now. "A garden where I can grow flowers. And maybe I can teach you how to grow them too." Jackson smiled, feeling a lump form in his throat. "I'd love that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll make it happen. Together." Lucy smiled back, a real smile that reached her eyes, and for a moment, Jackson allowed himself to believe that they could build something beautiful together. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, and times when Lucy would retreat back into herself. But he had made a promise to her, and he was going to keep it. He would provide for her, protect her, and help her grow into the person she was meant to be. The following week, Jackson began making plans to start on the garden Lucy had dreamed about. He knew it would take time, but he wanted to give her something tangible to hold on to, something that would symbolize their new life together. The garden wasn't just about flowers, it was about roots. It was about grounding them in this new reality, one where they were a family, where Lucy had a home and a future. He spent his weekends working on the garden, with Lucy by his side. She wasn't always involved, but there were moments when she would come out and help plant a flower or water the plants, her face lighting up with excitement when they saw their efforts starting to grow. It was slow progress, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were building something together, and with each passing day, they were growing closer. One evening, as Jackson sat on the porch, watching Lucy play in the yard, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. His life was no longer just about work, no longer just about business deals and success. His purpose had shifted. It was no longer defined by the deals he closed or the money he earned. It was defined by the little girl who had come into his life and changed everything. Lucy came over to him, her face bright with joy, holding a small flower she had picked from the garden. She handed it to him with a smile, and Jackson took it gently, his heart swelling with pride. "This is for you, Daddy," she said, her voice full of affection. Jackson smiled, feeling a rush of love he hadn't expected. He had come into this situation not knowing what he was doing, unsure of how he could make a difference in Lucy's life. But now, sitting here with her, he knew he had done the right thing. They had come a long way, and though the journey ahead would be long and challenging, he was ready for it. For the first time in a long time, Jackson felt like he had found something that truly mattered. And he would do whatever it took to protect it. "I'll keep it forever," he said, looking at the small flower in his hand. "Just like I'll always be here for you, Lucy." She beamed up at him, and in that moment, Jackson realized that being her father was the most important thing he could ever be. No matter what the future held, he knew that he would never stop fighting for her, for the life they were building together. The following year brought with it both challenges and growth, and Jackson found himself settling into his role as Lucy's father more than he had ever thought possible. Every day wasn't perfect, and there were moments when he questioned whether he was doing enough, but he was learning. He was learning to be patient, learning to listen, and most importantly, learning to give his love without expectations. The days were long, but the rewards were greater than he had anticipated. Lucy was blossoming in ways he had never expected, and so was he. Their routine had become somewhat predictable, but in the best way possible. Mornings were spent rushing through breakfast and school preparations. The afternoons were filled with homework and small moments of shared laughter. Jackson had adjusted his schedule to spend more time with her, and though his business never slowed down completely, he found himself giving less and less attention to his empire. The balance between being a CEO and being a father had been difficult to strike at first, but as the months passed, he found a way to manage both. One afternoon, as Jackson walked into the kitchen after a meeting, he noticed Lucy sitting at the table, her brow furrowed as she stared at a piece of paper. Her homework, as always, was taking longer than usual. She was often distracted, and while Jackson understood that her past had left deep scars, it still frustrated him at times. He had never been the patient type, but being a parent was teaching him a different kind of strength. "Everything okay?" he asked, sitting down beside her. Lucy looked up, her face a mixture of concentration and frustration. "I don't get it," she said, pushing the paper away. "It's too hard." Jackson leaned in, looking at the assignment. It was a simple math problem, but he could see that it was more than just numbers to Lucy. It was a wall she had to climb, a challenge that made her feel small. She had come a long way since she first arrived at his home, but her insecurities still lingered. He didn't want to push her too hard, but he also wanted her to know that she was capable of overcoming challenges. "Let's take it one step at a time," Jackson said, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "You can do this. You don't have to do it all at once. We'll work through it together." She nodded slowly, though her uncertainty was clear. Jackson took a deep breath and began walking her through the problem. He didn't rush her. He didn't try to do it for her. Instead, he asked questions, guided her, and gave her the space to figure it out on her own. When she finally got the right answer, her face lit up with a small, but genuine smile. "I did it," she said, her voice full of pride. "You sure did," Jackson replied, his voice filled with warmth. He was amazed by how far she had come. She was learning not just math, but confidence. She was learning that she was capable, that the walls in front of her could be broken down, no matter how high they seemed. Later that night, as Jackson tucked her into bed, he sat beside her for a moment longer than usual. Lucy had come so far, and yet, there were still times when she would close herself off, when her past would creep up on her. But tonight, as she lay there in the quiet of her room, Jackson felt a deep sense of peace. They were no longer strangers, no longer bound by legal obligations. They were family now, and the bond between them had become undeniable. "Good night, Daddy," Lucy whispered, her small hand reaching out to him. "Good night, Lucy," Jackson said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you." The words had come easily now. At first, they had felt foreign to him, uncomfortable even. But now, they felt right. He loved her, not because of obligation, but because she had become a part of him. He had never known that kind of love before, and it had transformed him in ways he could never explain. As he turned off the light and stepped out of her room, Jackson felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He had come into this situation thinking that he was the one doing the saving, that he was the one who would make a difference in Lucy's life. But the truth was, she had saved him in ways he hadn't even realized. She had given him purpose, a reason to believe in something greater than himself. And in turn, he had done his best to give her the love and security she had always deserved. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Jackson watched as Lucy continued to grow, as she built confidence in herself, and as she slowly began to trust him with more of her heart. Her walls, once so high, were coming down piece by piece. She still had her bad days, moments of fear and doubt, but they were fewer now. There was laughter in their home, something Jackson had never imagined would be a part of his life. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden they had worked so hard to build, Jackson looked at Lucy, who was now playing with a few of her friends in the yard, her laughter filling the air. He realized that this garden, this space they had created together, was more than just a physical place. It was a symbol of everything they had built, the trust, the love, the healing. It was a space where Lucy could grow, just as he was. It wasn't just about flowers and trees, it was about the roots they had put down, the foundation they had set for their future. Jackson had once thought that life was about climbing the highest peaks, achieving the greatest successes. But now, he understood that the real meaning of life came from the moments that mattered, the quiet moments, the shared smiles, the small victories. He had found something more valuable than all the wealth and success in the world. He had found love, and it was in those quiet moments, with Lucy by his side, that he realized he had everything he needed. The future was still uncertain. There would always be challenges to face, obstacles to overcome, but Jackson no longer felt afraid. He had Lucy, and together, they would navigate whatever came their way. For the first time in his life, Jackson knew that love was the greatest legacy he could leave behind, and it was the legacy he would build for Lucy. In my opinion, the ending of this story reflects a powerful transformation, not just for Jackson, but for the concept of family and personal growth. Jackson started off as a man who prided himself on control and success, a man who avoided emotional connections and had no real experience with fatherhood. His journey through uncertainty, doubt, and self-reflection mirrors what many of us go through when faced with unexpected, life-changing situations. What makes the ending so compelling is that Jackson doesn't necessarily find happiness in the way he anticipated. It's not about achieving more wealth or securing more business deals, but about his emotional evolution. Through his journey of becoming Lucy's father, he discovers a love that is far more profound and fulfilling than any career accomplishment. By the end, we see him realizing that what truly matters is the connections we make, the trust we build, and the lives we change. The ending emphasizes that family doesn't